I'm Tristan, and this is Thinking About Politics. So today, we're continuing our examination of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. That's that government that was set up by the United States and NATO from roughly 2001 to 2021. And we're going to survey the major presidential and legislative elections of that country's history. And if you want to help us continue to make political content that's grounded in facts, you can go ahead and hit the subscribe. That helps us a lot. You can also go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. That's mighty helpful as well. So, survey of Afghan elections. What do I mean by survey? I mean an overview. We're going to quickly look at things and move along and try to get some rough idea of what the whole looks like. Here, I got an example for you. Let's start with a survey of the books on my top shelf over there. See, you start here over at the left with Alexander the Great. I could tell you about how my grandfather gave me this book and made me read it against my will. I could tell you what's inside. I could tell you when it was published. But we aren't here to learn all about Emperor Alex T. Great. We're surveying the books. Got to keep moving. Ooh, a few Ron Chernow books. That's interesting. I wonder if that means anything. Nope, no time. Keep going. I'm starting to think maybe this is some sort of biography section. And then it abruptly stops at the Grapes of Wrath, Germinal, and the Theban Plays. So I could go on for hours about each of these works. I could tell you why they are there, why I placed them in that particular order, how each of these works moved me the first time I read them. But we ain't got time for that. This is a survey. We keep going by the Morrison until we come to the Undertaker here, who's blocking your view of the Hemingway. And then we finish off with some holy books, including the Holy Bible, guarded aptly by the best there was, the best there is, and the best there ever will be, Bret the Hitman Hart. Now, again, we can go on and on and on about the symbolism of Bret the Hitman Hart holding down the holy word of God, but that ain't part of our survey. The point is, we're going to be covering stuff really like super fast, and there's a lot of details we're just not going to cover. Our primary source of information is going to be the New York Times articles that were written during these elections, as well as government reports, the Special Investigator General for Afghan Reconstruction, and other credible sources. As always, we're going to put all of our relevant citations and references in the thingy down there, so you can go and find them. But there are going to be things that we just have to summarize, or omit unintentionally, or omit intentionally. It's just part of the game of this survey. The idea is not to make any of us an expert in any one of these elections, or Afghan elections generally, but just to give you a rough idea of some pertinent facts. See what trends are sort of obvious to us. Maybe this will give us a better picture of how things were going when the United States pulled out the way it did. Maybe it'll shed some light on why that country fell so quickly to the Taliban. So, yeah, let's get going. 2004 presidential election. So as I said before, we're going to be talking about two kinds of elections here. There are presidential elections that are supposed to be held every 5 years, and then there are also legislative, district, provincial elections as well. 2004 was the presidential election, the first one ever for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Elections were held on October 9th, 2004, but results were not made official until November 3rd, 2004. What took so long? Well, at the last minute, 15 of the 18 candidates threatened to boycott the elections. They accused each other and the frontrunner and then caretaker president Hamid Karzai of engaging in voter fraud and corruption. See, the thing was, in Afghanistan at that time, voter registration wasn't exactly closely tracked. So to prevent fraud, the idea was voters would dip their left thumb in indelible ink. So if someone showed up to the polling place and their thumb was covered in ink, they couldn't vote. Problem was, in some places, either through malicious intent or just by mistake, these inks were not mixed correctly, and you could actually wash them off and go vote again. There were wide reports of this happening. Not to mention charges of voter intimidation and coercion by the campaign of Hamid Karzai and other campaigns. International observers had to get involved, and eventually they declared Hamid Karzai the winner. Although the election irregularities certainly had effects in localities, international observers did not feel that voter fraud would have affected the whole. Karzai won 55% of the vote, according to these monitors. The next closest candidate of the 18 only got 16%. But that's it. Karzai goes from caretaker president to full-blown elected president, and the Islamic Republic is off to the races. Remember when we talked about the Constitution? The president of Afghanistan gets a lot of power to appoint ministers, members of the government. Karzai would take this opportunity to remove some warlords from the cabinet, but he certainly kept on others that were more useful to him. He also canned the guy who would eventually become the next president, Ashraf Ghani. I think that's kind of funny. But Mr. Karzai's first cabinet was largely composed of factional leaders representing the country's different political and ethnic groupings. Many had been powerful and popular commanders, but lacked the education and skills for their portfolios. Karzai's government relied more on ethnic Pashtuns, less on the strongmen and the warlords, who tended to be more ethnically diverse. So, all things considered, 15 candidates threatening to boycott your election results, the ink issue, allegations of fraud, needing international observers to settle things. It's not like the best start. But in the United States, these elections were hailed as a massive success. And in part, it's because, things could have been so much worse. There could have been a lot more violence. There could have been far more chaos in the counting. Imagine if the election was closer and these allegations of fraud maybe would have had more of an effect on the outcome of the Karzai election. So, 2004. Call this one a draw. 2004 elections, okay? Messy but manageable. Let's keep going. 2005 National Assembly elections. September 18th, 2005 saw the election of National Assembly members. You'll remember that this is the big legislature, almost like Congress, for Afghanistan. But this time, results were not announced until November 12th, 2005. And 2004 definitely had allegations of fraud. 2005 saw even more, with international observers finding, quote, significant incidents of fraud. This time, it was far more likely that the voter fraud actually had more outsized effects in different districts and different areas. However, what those effects were are really tough to quantify. 2005 saw many more religious conservatives, former fighters and jihadists, strongmen, warlords elected to office. One diplomat said that the legislature would, quote, have a more Islamist flavor than the current pre-2005 government. A more Islamist flavor than what existed before. And that's saying something. This is the government America built and funded. Wild. 2009, presidential elections. All right, now things are really starting to go off the rails. So Afghanistan has what's called a runoff system, which is a very common way of doing your elections. It essentially works like this. You have an election. If somebody gets 50%, boom, you're done. If nobody gets 50%, you take the top two finishing candidates and they go head-to-head in a runoff election. Somebody gets 50% and you're golden. That's going to be relevant here in a second. See, on August 20th, 2009, Afghanistan held its regular election. And corruption and voter fraud just got worse. One story tells of a polling worker who arrived on the morning of Election Day to find his ballot boxes already stuffed with ballots. When he complained, security pulled him away. And there may have been widespread systematic fraud by Hamid Karzai at the expense of his main rival, a guy by the name of Abdullah. He's going to keep copping up from now on. Although Karzai pulled out to an early lead in the first election, he missed the 50% threshold. And in fact, there were so many fraudulent votes affecting his campaign, over 1 million of his votes had to be thrown out. Initially, Karzai refused to take place in a presidential runoff against the second-place finisher, Abdullah. Eventually, Karzai relented, saying he would take part in the runoff election. However, Abdullah ended up dropping out, claiming that he did not believe there would be a fair election, that this would just be an opportunity for more fraud. So, look, was Abdullah right? Maybe he would have lost anyway. So, maybe he's dropping out for that. But I guess the long and short is that Karzai now takes power for a second term, far less of a mandate than in his first term. There's a worsening political situation, worsening political corruption, and Hamid Karzai's big announcement during his inauguration speech was that he would call a Loya Jirga, a grand council, and invite members of the Taliban. However, as viewers of this channel will note, the Loya Jirga is a constitutionally defined body whose members are outlined in the Constitution. It's Karzai talking about. So it was bad. Voters in some areas were rounded up by armed warlords and herded to the polls, where the votes they cast were checked to make sure of their obedience. In other areas, entire voting districts returned thousands of votes with 100% of the ballots marked for a single candidate, even though all the polling places in those districts were closed because of security threats. So what type of legal and political culture is being birthed here? Reminder, the United States has been in Afghanistan for 8 years at this point, and won't be leaving for another 12. Just, wow. 2010 legislative elections. On September 18th, 2010, Afghans went back to the polls. Again, this time to elect members of that National Assembly and other provincial officials. So what's interesting here is that these elections were pushed by the United States and NATO. The Afghan government might have wanted to delay these a little bit, but NATO nations and the United States really wanted to show the success they were making in the country by having these elections go forward. Show some progress in the war effort. So around 2,500 candidates were running for 249 available seats. 1 in 6 candidates running for office would eventually come under investigation for fraud in this election. And the evidence was pretty obvious, too. There was video evidence of ballot stuffing, strongmen coercing election officials, sometimes handcuffing and detaining the election workers themselves. In other places, it was the election workers who ended up committing the fraud. One video purports to show election workers and members of a candidate's campaign haggling over the prices of votes. In the end, a quarter of all the votes had to be thrown out here, and a whole bunch more warlords won seats. Reports were pretty bleak, and it does not bode well for the young democracy here. The president, Hamid Karzai, a member of his cabinet, Ismail Khan, who's a well-known warlord, was recorded on audio tape discussing rigging of different parliamentary elections. In all, 25 candidates would be completely disqualified from office for fraud. 13 of the 25 were supporters of Hamid Karzai, including a cousin of his, not to mention the brothers of a few other high-ranking officials. Of course, President Karzai would respond by saying that the disqualification of these candidates had more to do with political rivalries than it did the actual administration of justice. So the results were delayed for an entire 3 months, bringing the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan to the brink of a constitutional crisis. Another result of this election was that because the Pashtuns ended up losing some representation in the legislature, it made the Taliban seem like a more attractive alternative. If persistent fraud and government corruption wasn't doing that already. Moving along. 2014 presidential election. So on April 5th, 2014, Afghans again went back to the polls to again pick a president. This time, Hamid Karzai could not run. He had served his 2 terms and was prevented constitutionally from running again. Now, I found some sources saying that the 2014 election was cleaner than the 2009 election. However, that's kind of like arguing one turd smells better than another. It might turn out to be true, but come on. There was a lower number of incidents of fraud reported, but there was also a lower amount of international observers keeping track of things. If this was a success, results weren't made official until John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, had brokered a peace deal between the 2 most prominent candidates, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah. He's back. So how is that a success? Well, it could be that success in the $120 million Western-funded election has been important to donor countries who need a clean vote to persuade restless electorates back home that it is worth continuing to support the Afghan government despite persistent complaints about corruption and growing hostility towards the West. A power-sharing agreement was worked out between Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah. Ashraf Ghani would serve as president, and Abdullah would take a newly created position called Chief Government Executive. Doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution, but hey, whatever gets you over the hump here. So was this cleaner? It ended in a power-sharing agreement, so that's nice. But remember, still, over a quarter of all the votes cast were cast in polling places that had some reported irregularity. So, at bare minimum, at least there was a peaceful transfer of power from Karzai to Ghani. So that something. 2015 legislative elections. So in 2015, the term for at least some elected legislators was due to come up. So, according to the Constitution, an election needed to be held. But Afghanistan had not made any plans to hold these elections. You can imagine that the months they had to spend negotiating between Ghani and Abdullah probably had something to do with their inability to plan for another election. President Ghani ended up issuing a decree saying that he would extend the term of legislators. So, crisis averted? But, where he got that power is really anybody's guess. We read the Constitution. I didn't see that power. So, you have this presidential election that's clouded by allegations of fraud and settled by an international agreement with power brokers from the United States. Now you have a parliament whose term is about to end and no plans to re-elect anybody. You're just going to have that potentially corrupt president extend these legislative terms. And that doesn't look good. That seems like it'd be a problem. But hey, I'm sure they'll get things together for 2016. 2018, legislative elections. So elections for the legislature were 3 years late. 3 years! And when they did hold the elections, it wasn't great. 78 people were killed in Taliban attacks. Another 470 civilians were injured. In all, about 1/3 of the country was now held by the Taliban, and there was no polling held there at all. In the weeks before the election, at least 10 candidates were assassinated, and dozens of supporters killed. Then on election day, there was a myriad of technical difficulties, including long lines. And then, of course, there were the now predictable allegations of voter fraud and ballot stuffing. Allegations that maybe the government was trying to inflate the number of voters. So we're getting pretty close to the conclusion here, and I hope you can understand that these elections we've had since 2001 have not exactly gone well. Corruption and fraud have proved endemic, and that has gone on to fuel violence, and that violence has gone on to fuel more distrust in the government. Well, this is the second to last election that the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan would ever hold. Yeah. 2019 presidential election. And the last election that the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan held was a presidential election between Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah. Big ol' rematch. Ghani, of course, was asking the people to give him a second term. He was calling himself the state builder, which is ironic given what we know happens in the end. By now, the Afghan Election Commission had new measures to try to prevent ballot stuffing and corruption that had happened in the past, including biometric markers and other high-tech solutions. However, this being an Afghan election, there still were signs of ballot stuffing. The technology meant to prevent fraud was used to conceal fraud, and Wikipedia put the voter turnout at like 20%. However, despite this overall low turnout, around election time, some areas were reporting election turnout as high as 90%. And these are areas where there were so few voters, voting was extended 2 hours to try to coax more people to come in. So these are some funny numbers we're getting. The election was held on September 28th, 2019, but results weren't made official until February 2020. That's 5 months. And this time when Ghani claimed to be the winner, Abdullah claimed to be the winner too. And when Ghani was sworn in his office, Abdullah held himself a swearing in as well. And if that's not crazy enough, on the day that they both took the oath of office, March 9th, there was a rocket attack on the inaugurations trying to disrupt them. And this election was going on at a time when the United States was negotiating directly with the Taliban. The Trump administration promised the Taliban directly they would withdraw United States forces by 2021. It's this promise that led the Taliban to target the Afghan forces and leave American forces alone. So this democracy was rotting from within, and the United States had a foot out the door. Instead of being able to deal with the security situation, or the U.S. withdrawal, or the plague that descended upon all of us in 2020, this government lost 5 months trying to figure out who was going to be in charge. In the end, Ghani may have won the battle, but he lost the war. Literally. Before finishing his second term, Ashraf Ghani fled the country on August 15, 2021, as the Taliban invaded Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. He was accused of embezzling cash as he left the country, a charge that he has denied. His vice president, Amr Salah, claimed to be the caretaker president of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and withdrew to the Panjshir Valley, home to the resistance against the Taliban in the 1990s, and declaring a national resistance front. He may have fled the country after the Taliban seized much of Panjshir on September 6, 2021. Perhaps he's in Tajikistan. Doesn't seem like people really know right now. But for now, that seems to be the end of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So, what happened? The Special Investigator for Afghan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, wrote a report in February 2021, and it made some findings that we ought to consider. Election fraud in Afghanistan is rampant and takes many forms. Political leaders exert influence over senior election officials and, through them, lower-level staff. The election commissioners and their senior staff sells their services for financial gain. Senior election officials thus play an ambiguous role, serving variously as protectors of the process, perpetrators of the fraud, illicit collaborators with senior government officials, and victims of their abuses. Fraud is also perpetrated by local power brokers trying to curry favor with candidates in the anticipation of a reward in the form of government contracts, jobs, or payoffs. It is difficult to detect and prove fraud, and even harder to reduce it. Anti-fraud measures are often co-opted to perpetrate more fraud, and even successful fraud mitigation can end up suppressing legitimate votes, sometimes in ways that favor one group or another. Election fraud is increasingly centralized in the dispute resolution process at the provincial and central headquarters, where fraudsters can have the biggest impact for the least effort, as well as the fewest witnesses and the thickest smokescreen. Chaos and malpractice in the central and provincial electoral bodies in the resolution of disputes creates ideal conditions for both election commissions to make changes to the results, and since there's no expectation of transparency, perpetrators can commit fraud with impunity. As a result, the process that is supposed to root out fraud is instead where some of its most potent forms occur. You can almost look at it this way. In Afghanistan, elites viewed elections as only a way to get power. They were often willing to cheat and to break the rules if it meant that they could win. There's nothing holy and nothing sacred about the election process there. It's just another transaction. And knowing what you know about the corruption of Afghan elections now, and about how the country's government was seen as maybe less than legitimate to a lot of people, I mean, does this look like a democracy to you? They couldn't even hold an election together. It's a shame to see the Taliban take over, but whatever criticisms you might have about President Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan and how it was conducted, I am very happy that there are no more Americans coming home in flag-draped coffins trying to prop up the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. I made myself sad now. So I guess that'll be it for me. You've been great, especially if you made it this far. Hope to see you again, but until next time, keep thinking.